Hi everyone, my name's Amy Rose. Welcome to day 4 of Blockchain Week. We're about to hear from Jack Deeb, Mycelium, and Aaron Wright from Tribute Labs. They're going to be talking about DAOs and DeFi, developments and regulation. Take the stage, Jack and Aaron.
Thanks, Amy Rose, and hello, Blockchain Week. In this fireside session, we'll be discussing developments and regulation relating to DAOs and DeFi, as Amy mentioned. And I personally believe that there's no better person to weigh in on this topic than Aaron Wright. Aaron Wright's a co-founder of Tribute Labs, which was formerly known as OpenLaw. Tribute Labs has launched some of the most successful DAOs in the space, including the Lao, Flamingo DAO, and Neptune DAO. Aaron's also recently worked with industry and government in the state of Wyoming to draft the DAO bill in Wyoming, which ultimately led to DAOs being recognized in the state. Aaron is also a leader within the Ethereum community and has been involved with Ethereum since Ethereum launched. So some of you may know Aaron for his other efforts in the space. So Aaron, it's my pleasure to have you here for Blockchain Week. Thank you for joining us. My first question for you, Aaron, is for those who don't know, what is a DAO?
It's a great question. And thanks so much, Jack, and thanks, Amy, for the warm introduction. I've gotten to know Jack from and the rest of the Mycelium team through a bunch of our DAOs, and it's been a pleasure and really an honor to kind of work together in some of those DAOs. So we're talking about DAOs. DAOs are a really broad topic. They cover a whole bunch of different potential organizations. I kind of bucket them into 3 kind of core categories right now. But at a high level, you can think of them as just a new organizational structure that's trying to be a bit flatter in nature. So if you think about lots of companies or organizations that you may work for or are a part of today, they're very hierarchical. It's almost like the military, right? You've got a board of directors, you have officers, and then you have employees and, supervising employees, then you have kind of like line employees. And what DAOs are trying to explore is how do you make a flatter organization? And the reason that folks want to make flatter organizations is because it A, mirrors the internet, and B, if it's flat, you can actually go a bit further out and hopefully have organizations that are much larger than they are today. So there's 2 ways to do that. One way is to use new blockchain-based tools and smart contracts, which are pretty efficient in order to have flat and more participatory DAOs. So DAOs where people kind of weigh in. The second, more futuristic vision for a DAO is to not even have humans making decisions, but at some point to have algorithms make decisions. We're not there yet. That's going to take quite some time to kind of get there. The areas where we're seeing the most activity with DAOs right now are DAOs where people are pooling together capital to make investments together. We're starting to see DAOs where people are using an NFT or some sort of token gating to create a guild or a group of folks that are providing services. And then in the DeFi context, we're seeing a whole bunch of DAOs that are trying to manage an open source smart contract based system. So I kind of view that as like a modern riff on a software foundation. So instead of having the Linux Foundation or some of the other major open source software foundations, lots of the developers in the space want to have that managed by the community and a whole bunch of others through a DAO. Another analogy that people have used is you can think of a DAO like right now, like a subreddit or a Facebook group or some sort of chat group with a bank account. That's another way to think about it. And that's, I know, a small shift. Like, why would you want to add a bank account to a chat group or a bunch of folks that are interested in the same topic? But it's actually pretty profound. It enables people to not just chat with one another, develop relationships, but actually, use this common pool of assets to do things that are more productive, right? No longer just shit posting and like sharing links and, like making fun of folks or trying to organize like an online mob. You can actually, work together to do something more productive, which I think is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And there's so much to unpack there. I think reflecting on the last couple of days in Blockchain Week in Sydney and Melbourne, as I was walking around, there were at least 5 people who brought up the question, what is a DAO? And I think education at this stage in what DAOs are and what decentralized systems are is so important because frankly, a lot of people don't really understand what's going on with DAOs and decentralized systems. And that leads me to my next question. I think one of your most interesting achievements is what happened in Wyoming. And it was both a technical challenge, but I imagine also an educational challenge as well. So can you please tell us a little bit about your experience in Wyoming, how the DAO bill came about, and also what lessons that...
Sure. So Wyoming, for those that may not be familiar, it's a small state in kind of the mountain region of the United States, and it's been very favorable to crypto. At this point, it's passed, I think, 15 to 18 separate bills, just dealing with all the legal challenges related to digital assets and kind of this future commercial system that so many people around the globe want to build. So they've clarified things related to tokens. They've enabled more traditional banks to handle digital assets, and they're constantly looking to be supportive to the crypto community. So they began to think about, what they could do next. I've worked with some folks on different committees in Wyoming in the past, and I noted that they may want to pay attention to DAOs just because that's something that I think is coming. It's a pretty big category and something Wyoming may want to get ahead of. I think that resonated in Wyoming because Wyoming actually invented an organizational structure that's pretty popular here in the US, and it's mirrored in other parts of the globe, although sometimes it has different names, the LLC, so the Limited Liability Company. So that was pioneered by Wyoming. They invented that and implemented laws in the 1970s in order to accommodate different oil and gas deals that were coming out of the state. And so, they were pretty receptive to it. This idea and what ultimately got implemented in Wyoming is that you're able to set up something called a DAO. You don't need to call it an LLC. You can actually call it a DAO. And the goal of the bill was both to recognize that this is a new organizational structure and to really piggyback on existing corporate law in Wyoming, but flip some defaults so it was a little bit cheaper in order to hopefully set it up. And I think it was a great first step towards kind of recognizing these emerging, mostly online groups and their ability to begin to get basic protection that other folks would if they were setting up a more established brick and mortar traditional business. The concept related to wrapping a DAO or kind of anchoring a DAO in a limited liability company or some sort of legal entity, that started even before Ethereum launched. There was a whole bunch of events at MIT. Which is a well-known technical college in the US, before the launch of Ethereum, where people began to think about questions related to digital assets and things like DAOs, and questions emerged as to how could the real world interact with digital assets? How could we acquire property, or how could we acquire something like the Constitution, or which kind of captured the internet's attention for at least a moment? And the thought was we could anchor it in a legal entity and kind of wrap a DAO in something that's a little bit more traditional under the hood. But DAOs are different than LLCs. Sometimes you may hear, a DAO is just an LLC. That's not really the case. And the law that was passed in Wyoming, it's really a first step. It's not going to be appropriate for lots of different DAOs. But for some, I think it's really helpful and useful. So lots more work needs to be done there, but it was at least a good first step. And hopefully other states in the US and hopefully other jurisdictions can learn from that and get comfortable with accepting DAOs.
Yeah, I think steps are a good way to think about it. And last year in Australia, we had our first step, or maybe half step, with an Australian Senate committee led by an Australian Senator Bragg, who recommended that Australia establish DAOs as a company structure, similar to what had passed in Wyoming. And following that, the Australian Treasury actually agreed with the recommendation and has since been consulting with industry on an appropriate regulatory structure for DAOs. I think what I'd like to hear from you is, how do you expect DAO regulation to evolve? So how do you sort of see those steps playing out, and particularly for companies like Australia that don't already have structures for member-managed companies?
Yeah, so that's the one differentiating thing in the United States. We're very, very comfortable with different people just arranging their affairs via contracts. It's called private ordering. So we love contracts in the US. We're happy to have People just organize their affairs with a contract without much government oversight. And there's very, very strong notions of that in the US. Other parts of the globe are not as comfortable with that approach. And they require having an express manager or somebody that's in charge of the organization. So if that's a corporation, that's the board, right? If that's a limited liability entity, that's going to be like a managing member or something equivalent. I think that's the first step. You know, in the U.S. since the literally for decades at this point, we've been very comfortable with member-managed entities. Probably almost 100 plus years. The United States has not fallen off a cliff. Commerce has continued. There hasn't been rampant amounts of fraud. So it would seem sensible to just permit that type of structure. There's another DAO structure I played around with quite a bit. Also, we kind of pioneered, which is more of a not-for-profit structure that's member managed. And it's kind of the same idea. I think that could work really well for DAOs or folks that want to build open source, like modern riffs on open source foundations or other kind of groups that are a little less formal than like a traditional business entity. So I think that's the first step. I don't know how much of a lift that would be, but I from my vantage point, and Jack, you know this, participating in some of the DAOs that we support, there's just a tremendous amount of talent in Australia. And I think what we've learned with both crypto and Web3 is that this is really the first technical revolution that is truly global in nature. It's almost like the Olympics. Everybody's kind of competing and there's amazing athletes from around the globe, right, that are all getting to weigh in. And not surprisingly, a lot of the talented entrepreneurs in Australia that may have had a hard time raising capital or getting attention on their project before now have that ability to do it. And if what's going to block them from participating in this global economy is the need to have a manager, that just seems a little understandable why you want that, but a little short-sighted, I think, in the long run. So that's, I think, a good first place to go. The other thing I just note is, one jurisdiction that could be the US is going to kind of become a large locus for DAOs. And since they operate on the internet, you're not going to have lots of different local jurisdictions. I think you're going to see one or a handful of jurisdictions really become the locus for lots of different organizational structures over time. Not now, but like in 50 years, you're not going to see people want to set up subsidiaries in different countries, et cetera. It's too complex. They're just going to want to set up in one place, kind of run their business. And that business could be quite large, or something that's more not-for-profit in nature, or something that's a little something in between.
I like that way of thinking about it. Everyone with an internet connection coordinating on Ethereum, creating the DAO Olympics, and I think rounds 1 and 2 in the DAO Olympics have been DAOs used for DeFi and NFTs, and DAOs becoming involved in each of those sort of sub-industries within the broader public blockchain industry. And one question that I get a lot, and I'm sure that you would as well, is how would you describe the connection between a DAO and DeFi or DAOs and NFT projects? In fact, a DAO and any project, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so with DeFi, I really think at its core, it's this notion of how do we manage this underlying smart contract-based system? So smart contracts are systems, right? Or at least in DeFi, they're an entire system that's set up using software, but oftentimes they have certain parameters that need to get set. Kind of like knobs on the machine that need to get tweaked or changed. Maybe you want to put in, for the benefit of the users, different fallbacks or abilities to upgrade the underlying smart contract, all reasonable things that people want to do. And the software development team is humble enough to say, we don't know the answer here. Right? We want to have this managed by our community, not just us, but also our users, people that love the project, were interested in the project, our investors. A whole group of different people should weigh in so that we can manage collectively, this system in an appropriate way. And I think that that's really important. In lots of different jurisdictions, like in Germany and in academic literature in the US, there's been lots of emphasis on stakeholder governance, having all the relevant parties kind of weighing in. And the thesis is that will lead to more stable systems, right? So if you're thinking about these really, really important open source, pretty automatic financial products and services that people are are building, we can imagine a world where they're more stable, right? They operate more like open source technology, like Linux, which powers your computer, or Wikipedia, which is a great repository for information. And those systems work pretty well. They're not perfect, but that's really the relationship, I think, at its core. And in most DAOs, there's a token, a governance token, where people can weigh in on those parameters and decisions. So they're not often promising profits or losses. It's not exactly like a corporation. They're just saying like, hey, you're a user, you should weigh in on these types of things, or hey, you were an early supporter backer, you should weigh in on those things. And I think that seems pretty sensible and reasonable. I'm sure that some people can abuse that, and there may be some fraud or some other concerns, but the core piece of what's going on in DeFi, I think, is pretty great. When it comes to NFTs, I think we're seeing two things. One is people pull together capital to purchase NFTs together, which is awesome. And then I think we're also seeing groups come together to create NFTs, which is also really interesting. So one is, sometimes media, which is primarily NFTs today, it's hard to create. Think Hollywood, right? It's not like one person is creating a Marvel movie, right? It's hundreds of people. So people are banding together to create high quality media that's globally accessible, globally tradable, which is great. If you're a creative worker or a creative team, doesn't matter if you're where you're located, you're able to now introduce that to the entire world. Just look at a project like Bored Apes, which I'm sure many folks have heard about. My understanding is they were from like North Carolina, not really where you expect to see massive media properties come out, at least in the US. It's not California, it's not New York, it's not LA. But yet that's what came out, right? And the internet kind of has been really excited about that. On the collecting side, I think it's people are pooling capital together to make the investments because there's a lot of NFT projects. It's really hard to filter out the good projects from the bad projects. It's really hard to know who's going to be an emerging creator. And a group is just better able to do that than an individual. If you're sitting there on Twitter trying to follow every NFT project, or in Discords or in Telegrams, your eyes would fall out of your head. You'd look like that meme with the like sullen person. You'd be dead, right, after a little bit of time. But banding together like in a group, you're able to kind of make sure that you're staying on top of things and learn about things that you may not necessarily have seen before.
I think a few of us are pretty close to dead, not quite there yet, but with the Discord notifications and Telegram notifications and the new projects.
You got to turn them off. You got to turn off the notifications.
You got to turn them off or hold on for dear life. Yeah. I think thinking about these systems in a long-term sense, and your analogies to Linux and Wikipedia, and subreddits with bank accounts. And even before, you touched on the idea of a global entity without subsidiaries. I think there is somewhat consensus on where we're heading, but that's going to take some time. And I think one thing that we need to expect in the next 1 to 2 years is continued efforts from jurisdictions like US with the executive order and like Australia, like we touched on earlier. And the short to medium term problem is still going to be a really interesting one. So if you could think a little bit more short term, how do you sort of see DAOs evolving in the next 12 months? What sort of steps do you think that we're likely to see, successful or not, in this environment?
Yeah, well, I think you touched on this before, Jack. You were saying you're walking around Blockchain Week and lots of people are talking about DAOs, but they don't know exactly what they are. Because I'm a little long in the tooth when it comes to crypto. I've been doing this since like 2011. It kind of reminds me of early days of Bitcoin and early days of Ethereum, where people are really just ideating on the future use cases. I think just in general, there's a demand from the next generation of people around the globe who grew up on the internet. They want to do more with the friends and connections they made online than just chat in a room, right? They want to work together. COVID accelerated this, where it was easier and easier to work remotely. And that's kind of the long-term trend. So I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to figure out, what does that future work look like? How can we create organizations that are not as hierarchical, that are more permissive and open-ended, where you can hop in and do the work that you're good at and possibly work for a whole bunch of different organizations at the same time, and not have a boss, not necessarily have somebody looking over your shoulder, not have to go into a physical office space. There's a lot of folks around the globe that's how they want to work, right? And they're trying to figure out what that looks like. So lots of people are ideating on it. There's lots of DAO experiments that are very ambitious that are probably too early. Either the tech's not there's not enough users that are able to do it. The governance may not be fully fleshed out and baked out. So lots of people are kind of ideating and thinking really big dreams. Now, some of that's going to work. There's other folks that are working on the tooling, the Pixes and the Axes. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there just to build the types of tools that people are going to need to kind of operate in this new environment. And then there's folks that are starting kind of on a smaller basis. That's what we're kind of doing. We're starting with groups of up to 100 people, and they're moving around a lot of capital. They're purchasing a whole bunch of different NFTs. They're backing a number of different projects, deploying capital into DeFi. And I think by starting small, we're figuring out a lot of the pain points that I think larger groups are also going to feel as well. If you build like a website to like scale up to 1 billion users on day one, it's kind of a waste. Like you just want to get something up and running and then iterate until it can scale up to 1 billion. So that's been kind of our approach, and it seems to be working pretty well. But we're at the beginning. We're like, not to use an American analogy, but we're like in the first inning of a baseball game, or I guess the first half of a football match or something like that. So we got a long way to go until this is all kind of sorted out.
Yeah, that's honestly where my mind goes as well. It's thinking about Bitcoin and Ethereum and how long those communities took to get started, and now we think about Bitcoin and Ethereum as these decentralized networks, right? And perhaps even DAOs themselves. I think speaking about going into first innings, a lot of the DAOs that we know and love at the moment that aren't Bitcoin or Ethereum are still just getting started. And in 10 years, it's quite likely that we might think of them in the same way that we think of Bitcoin and Ethereum as these sort of autonomous networks servicing certain purposes. And on the topic of first innings and setting up for this future, congratulations on the successful transition of OpenLaw to Tribute Labs. Tribute Labs, I think, is uniquely or one of the first to sort of set up in this space to prepare for this future. So but for all those listening, could you give a bit of an overview of the problems that you're looking forward to solving with Tribute Labs in particular in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tribute Labs, we were kind of effectively like a research and development group inside of Consensus. So we've been working together for the past really almost 5 years. So we were doing lots of really early proofs of concepts on Ethereum, like real-time payments. I think we did the first fractionalized NFT. Like a proof of concept around it, which we didn't even realize, but we used a Doge meme in order to fractionalize it. So there's like some kind of poetic or poetics in that, which we thought was pretty interesting. And we were also just always geeked out with DAOs. So we started playing around with DAOs and notions of DAOs. And we really kind of found our footing with DAOs themselves. We're doing two things. We're building out a curated network of DAOs. We think that DAOs need a lot of support and that DAOs themselves are going to be better than traditional venture capital funds, hedge funds, Hollywood production companies. You kind of name a group that's pooling together capital to make an investment or return. I think DAOs in the long run are going to prove to be better at deploying capital and generating a return. And that's what we're focused on. So we're focused on how do we make better capital formation and deployment systems than what we have today. And if we're able to do that, then much like the LLC became a dominant structure in the US and other parts of the globe, starting in the 1970s, we think DAOs are going to follow the same path. So when we look back in 30 years, people won't even care about the name DAO, right? It's just going to be some business that they set up or some group that they set up, and it would just kind of fade into the background. So that's one area where we're really focused. We have a network now of 13 DAOs. The members themselves kind of tell us what they want to work on next, and we provide the support for it. That includes some that Jack mentioned, like Allow, Flamingo, Neon. There's also a digital fashion DAO called Red, a DAO focused on music called Noise, which is really great. We also have one that's focused on Zedrun, and it's a group of folks that have built an internet stable with fake internet money. So things are a little tongue in cheek. One focused on gaming, one focused on supporting female creators and diverse creators, which we think is important, and a whole bunch that are kind of coming through the pipeline. At the same time, our DAOs have done a lot of work together. They've acquired 7,000 NFTs, backed 150 projects, deployed millions of dollars into DeFi. So our members tell us where we can do better, right? What we can do better, the problems that we have, how we can make things tighter, faster, smoother. So we're building a whole bunch of tools that we think can service the DAOs and provide better service to the members too. And that is kind of all enabled by a framework called the Tribute DAO framework, which is a little bit more modular and flexible than other DAO frameworks that are out there now. We think of it like almost like a WordPress for DAOs. So like WordPress, amazing platform. If people wanted to set up a blog or set up a business CMS type system, they oftentimes turn to WordPress because they get like a core engine and then they can append in all these different bells and whistles onto it. We think organizations are similar. If anybody's been part of a group or a company, they change over time. Where you are, in year one, like you noted before, Jack, is not going to be the same as year 10. So you need something pretty flexible and adaptable and something that can change. So that's one of the problems that we're kind of, or those are the problems that we're really focused on right now.
Taking a bit of a turn, there's been an interesting conversation this week around, Eth Maxis. We saw Susano and Kane Warwick arguing yesterday about who's a bigger Eth Maxi. And right when I introduced you, I mentioned your contributions to Ethereum and the Ethereum community as well. One thing I'd like to get your opinion on, Aaron, is in the last couple of years, we've seen a few layer one competitors enter the space and a few that are here at Blockchain Week as well. How do you see this environment evolving with Ethereum and then competitive L1 chains?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a mixed minds here. So I'm definitely, I'd say, ETH leaning, borderlining on ETH Maxi, but I'm not. It's kind of like a strongly held opinion. What's that phrase? Strongly. I'm going to blunder it, but like
strong opinions loosely held, right?
Exactly. Thanks. It's a little late here. So I have a strong opinion, but it's loosely held. Like I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. I just haven't seen another ecosystem that I find that compelling. Like the things that I look for is just something really new that you can do on another blockchain that you can't do on Ethereum. I just haven't seen that much of anything yet. I'm skeptical about EVM compatibility. I think it's marketed, but I don't think it's pure 100% EVM compatibility, which is going to make it harder to do a lot of the cross-chain stuff. I think like Vitalik, I have questions about how well bridging and other cross-chain technology would be from a security perspective. But, I think it's great that different people are trying different things. In my mind, I think it's a lot like operating systems. If we were old enough, and I wasn't even around then, but some people told me this, but like in the 80s, there was 1 million operating systems, and then it kind of reduced down to kind of what we have today, which is like Microsoft, kind of Unix, Linux. I think that, that's going to be the same path for some of these blockchains. It's just really hard to build all the developer tooling to, really have all the integrations that Ethereum has at this point, and the brand recognition that Bitcoin and or increasingly Ethereum has. I just think that those create pretty steep moats that are going to be hard to kind of knock down. I also think, just looking at cross-chain, particularly with NFTs, we just haven't seen any significant value held on anything other than Ethereum for NFTs. So if you believe, and I increasingly believe this, that NFTs are going to be a bigger and bigger part of crypto, then it's just going to solidify ETH's lead even further. Even on Polygon or some of the other awesome layer twos, they're lower cost, but have this weird unintended consequence of also not holding any value. Like the outside of Zedrun, which is a great project, there hasn't really not been any significant projects that that can actually hold for a long period of time a significant amount of value on layer two. But I would love to see people experimenting with proof of stake and other consensus mechanisms and other kind of bridging technologies like we're seeing in some of those ecosystems. So maybe maybe there's an opening, or maybe just ETH kind of absorbs that over time. I don't really know where it lands. How about you, Jack? What do you think? Not to turn the question around. Are you on the ETH Maxi side or?
I like the phrase ETH leaning. We at Mycelium are working across a few blockchains, but I think just naturally, as you mentioned, we find ourselves working on Ethereum more than any other chain. So we'll continue to sort of try to keep the blinders off and seeing what's happening. But yeah, really looking forward to Ethereum's developments this year, particularly around mid-year with ETH2. Finally, maybe we'll see its development. But yeah, look, we've just hit the hour, Aaron. So before I start getting yelled at, I'd just like to thank you for answering my questions today and sharing your thoughts with us. I think it's been a really interesting session. I hope all the viewers online have enjoyed this one. And yeah, Aaron, is there anything you'd like to close with?
I just wanted to thank you, Jack. For those that don't know the Mycelium team, we've got to know them really well. They're amazing. And thanks so much for inviting me on. Really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.